Okay, hi everybody. My name's Juliet Sargeant and I work as a garden designer. I'm based in Brighton on the south coast and I work mainly in Sussex, East and West Sussex and Kent, designing people's gardens for them.
Brilliant, thanks. Now, how does gardening help you express yourself?
Well, I see gardening as a creative process. So if you're just growing, I don't know, something like a broad bean, perhaps at school you grew a broad bean in a jar, that is by definition a creative process. You're making something. So gardening at its very heart is creative, but I think even beyond just the growing plants, it's a way of expressing yourself. And I see it as an art form, really. You can think about when you're putting plants together, you're deciding, oh, this red plant will look really nice next to this plant that has yellow leaves, or I like the featheriness of another plant. So you're thinking about how to combine them artistically, creatively, and that's a really great thing to do. And really, there's no right or wrong about it. It's just whatever you like, whatever pleases you. So that's one aspect. But also, what I really love doing when I'm creating show gardens is using gardens and plants to express abstract ideas. So in the same way, a painter, an artist, might paint a scene, perhaps a field of poppies, something that he or she sees in front of him. That's one way of painting. But another way of painting is to create a completely abstract painting with blobs of colour or different shapes. And it may mean something, or it may not mean something, or it may be that the person looking at it has to interpret it for themselves. And so for me, gardens are exactly the same. You could garden on one level to create food, vegetables, garden on another level to create beautiful ornamental planting schemes, and yet on a third level you could be working in the abstract to express ideas or challenge people's thoughts or create a conversation.
That's really interesting, and I think I'd never thought about the connection between sort of expressing abstract ideas like in a painting or like in a conceptual piece through a garden. And in fact, in 2016, that's what you did. You designed a garden for the Chelsea Flower Show on the theme of modern slavery, which won gold. Now, I wouldn't usually associate the two, modern slavery and gardening. Can you tell us about that project and how you were able to express such a complex theme in a garden?
Yeah, well, I have to admit, it wasn't my idea in the beginning. I was approached by a team of people who had been working on the issue of modern slavery. So they had this real passion for trying to get this problem of modern slavery into people's consciousness. So it's the idea, modern slavery is the idea that people are held captive all over the world, in the UK, in your town, in my town, and forced to work in very poor conditions, perhaps for no money at all. So they are literally slaves in the modern era. And this group of people wanted to raise awareness about it. And they also happened to be very keen gardeners. So they thought to themselves, well, why don't we bring this idea, this campaign, to the Chelsea Flower Show, which is a sort of world famous show that is covered by all the media, newspapers, television, radio. And so they thought to themselves, if we can get a garden themed on modern slavery into the Chelsea Flower Show, then it'll be covered by the media and everybody who watches the Chelsea Flower Show will hear about this campaign and hear about this problem that needs to be solved. So they came to me and said, would you like to do this garden? And I leapt at the chance because I just love the idea of putting what, as you say, is quite a difficult concept, quite a thorny subject into a garden. And of course, at first I had no idea how on earth I was going to illustrate this idea in a garden. But whenever I'm doing a garden, I always start with research. So I did some research, and there were lots of little interesting facts and associations that just leapt out at me when I was doing my research. So, for example, the first thing I did was I went to Chelsea in London and had a walk round, and just to try and get some inspiration. How on earth am I going to cover this subject of modern slavery? And I noticed that, of course, if you look at a London Georgian house, they very often have railings, iron railings, and they have these lovely colourful Georgian doors. And I started to think, well, obviously railings, although they're decorative on a Georgian house, they could symbolise captivity. And the idea of a door could symbolise somebody being held behind that door, behind closed doors. Mm-hmm. So we walk around down our own streets through Chelsea and London, and we don't know if people are being held captive behind those closed doors. So that very quickly became the theme. I thought, well, that's it, I've got it. The idea that modern slavery is a crime behind closed doors. Mm-hmm. And so at Chelsea, if you're in the conceptual category, you can do crazy things like have doors and railings in a garden, because no one thinks that it's something that they're going to have at home in their back garden. They understand it as an art piece. So that's what I did. I had colourful doors and railings to represent the captivity. And I divided the garden into two parts. Mm-hmm. In the centre of the garden, behind the doors, everything was very dark, very bleak, representing the captive space. And then on the outside, the doors were colourful. We had lovely, luscious, bright planting, and that represented the free space where you and I live our lives happily in freedom.
So essentially what you did was you took the garden and split it into two to symbolize the different aspects of modern slavery, the visible and the invisible aspect, and you created a contrast. Now, that's really interesting. I think for a lot of us who want to infuse the work that we do with political ideas, we sometimes face obstacles doing that, right? And I love how you dug into the research and expressed that visually, just the way a painter or a visual artist might do.
Yeah, and for me, I thought it was really important to tell the story gently, because, basically, if people tune into Gardener's World or on the television, or they go and visit the Chelsea Flower Show, they're not really going to have some political message sort of rammed down their throats. They're going to look at a garden. They want to see pretty flowers. So I thought it was really important that the garden was colourful and beautiful, and I went to a lot of effort to put some interesting plants in there for the gardeners. And then the story of modern slavery was there on different levels. So I thought it was really important that if people just, didn't want to engage with the subject, that was okay. They could just enjoy the flowers. But then there were sort of subtle messages that people could read in the garden if they wanted to engage with the subject. And we had volunteers around the garden. So if people's interest was piqued and they wanted to ask more questions, they could learn more. So I think it's really important, and I do this with other conceptual gardens, that I tell the story on different levels so people can choose how much they engage with it.
Absolutely. So you sort of layer it.
Yeah.
Can you give us any examples? Like, is there anything, for instance, were there any particular flowers or plants that you picked which entailed a kind of a symbolism or a message in some form or another?
Well, actually, I didn't do it with the plants because I just wanted the plants to be a sort of feast of colour, and we had different colours schemes on the four sides of the garden. But I did it with the doors themselves. So, for example, the door numbers, it wasn't just 1, 2, 3, 4. The numbers represented some of the statistics about modern slavery. So, for example, there was the number 27, which represents the estimated 27 million people worldwide who are made to work as indentured workers or modern slaves. And then 13 was the number 13,000, which is the estimated number in the UK of people held in captivity. So people could see that the numbers weren't consecutive, and they would say, oh, what does that number mean? And then also on the doors, we had on the outside, in the free space, we had door handles and letterboxes. So your door will have a handle and a letterbox so that you can communicate with the outside world and you can go out whenever you like. Whereas on the inside of the doors, I had a lovely carpenter who sort of blocked up the letterboxes on the doors and took the handles off the inside. So on the inside, there's no way to communicate if you're held captive.
Right.
You cannot free yourself.
Right.
So there were just these sort of subtle messages in the garden.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Right, so some people might think of the UK as the last place where modern slavery takes place, but actually it's still one of the many nodes in the world where it continues to be practiced.
Yeah, because it was all news to me. I knew nothing about it when I started the project. But, you know, it is absolutely the case that in your neighbourhood, somewhere, maybe a car wash, a nail bar, people will be working under duress. Yeah.
Absolutely. That sounds really brilliant. Now, in terms of sort of on a more personal level, what do you think gardening can help you do to maintain a more balanced sort of well-being, whether that's physical or mental as well? I mean, we've heard a lot, I think particularly now, you know, you hear a lot about how important gardening is, and like, you know, and not just gardening in an outside space, but also indoor gardening, right? So like working with plants in general, and just the effect that they can have on you. What's your personal experience?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is something I'm really keen on, and I have been for years, because my first career was as a medical doctor, and I had a special interest in psychology and psychiatry.
Yeah.
So when I discovered that plants can actually make you healthier and make you happier, I thought, hey, you know, my two passions knitted together. And having trained as a scientist, I actually always like to think about the sort of evidence for things. And so I've been keeping a careful eye on the evidence. And although gardeners know in their hearts that when they go outside and potter around the garden, or they, you know, tinker about with their window box, you know, gardeners just will tell you, they know that it makes them feel good. But the scientists are now actually accumulating a significant body of evidence to say, yes, you know, we now have the evidence, this is actually correct. And it all started in the 1980s with a bit of research, which is, you know, it's still amazing to think about. What they did was they compared people who had operations, and some of the people were in a ward that had a view of the garden, and some were, I don't know, looking at bare walls. And they found that the people who had a view of the garden recovered quicker, reported less pain, and also needed fewer painkillers. And that sort of seminal research by a chap called Ulrich just sort of started off this whole sort of scientific body of work, really. And the thing about gardens is a lot goes on in a garden, so you can divide it up into different aspects. So there is the fact that if you're gardening, you are doing physical exercise. So that's one thing, that's really good for you. Everybody knows exercise is good for you. And gardening, because you're doing different activities, you may be bending down or digging heavily or tying something up. You're using different muscle groups, and it's also the sort of exercise that can be graded, because if you're very fit, you can do some double digging. If you're not so fit, you can just do something, you know, potting out seedlings, something a bit more gentle. So it's a very flexible way of exercising. So that's one thing. But then the scientists have also discovered that the this sort of psychological act of growing something. If you plant a seed, you are sort of saying that you are looking forward to the future. It's an act of hope, an act of anticipation, and then you see the seed grow. So psychologically, it's a very positive and optimistic thing to do, to plant a plant, watch it grow. Then another thing is scientists have found that actually getting your hands dirty, digging in the soil, has a positive effect on your immune system. So that's a good thing. What else to tell you? Oh, and another thing that scientists have found is that even if you're not a keen gardener, just going outside and being in the landscape, or being, even if you're inside in an office, having plants around you also has a positive effect on us as human beings. There's something about plants and something about landscape that is good for us, even if we're not gardening. So there's just so much that is positive about gardening and gardens and plants.
Absolutely, I would agree with that. I think especially the link to a sense of the future. I mean, just a few weeks ago, I was mainly taking care of the plants I already have. And it's only now that I'm slowly starting to grow stuff from seeds. And it's the first time that I'm doing that. And I wonder if maybe it reflects a change that I feel personally about the future and a sense of hope that I might have about the future. But I think there's another thing about gardening and taking care of plants, which is interesting. And that's particularly around this time, people seem to have lost a sense of a routine or a sense of a structure. And I wonder if it can help you reclaim that sense of a rhythm. And yeah, what do you think gardening and taking care of plants does in helping you recreate that sense of a structure in your life during the pandemic, particularly?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, that plants do need to be looked after. If they're if they're not in the wild, they do need to be looked after. So you naturally form into a habit of just checking how they're doing. Have they got enough water? Are there any dead leaves that need taking off? Although I have to admit, for myself, my life is a bit crazy and a bit busy. So it's not as structured as it could be, and possibly my plants might suffer a little bit from that. But the other thing I think that gardens and plants do is make you aware of the seasons and make you aware of the weather. Because I was speaking for myself, I can sort of, rush around and the whole day's gone and I haven't really noticed the fact that it's rained or that the sun has risen and set. And it just is a way of, I think, connecting you again with the rhythms of nature and the rhythms of landscape. I had some clients a few years ago who said to me that they wanted a garden that would remind them of the seasons. So they didn't want a garden that would look perfect all year round. They wanted to see things coming through in the spring and growing, and they wanted to see them becoming orange and yellow with the autumn and then dying in the winter, just to remind them in the way that sort of farmers of old would, or probably farmers today actually, keep an eye on what the weather's doing and watch what the seasons are doing, in a way that we who live in towns and cities just have lost the habit really of doing.
Absolutely. I mean, that's really beautiful. And I think especially when, especially in cities, but also in the West in general, right, we rely on a lot of foods that are grown in greenhouses. And so we lose that particular sense of the seasons because we can just get anything at any time of the year. And to have that garden, to have that emphasis in a garden, the emphasis of the cyclical is really beautiful.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Now, a lot of us don't have an outdoor space to garden and we rely on indoor gardens. What can someone do who has absolutely no previous experience of indoor gardening? And also, is there a difference between the two? Is there a difference between indoor gardening and outdoor gardening, or can I just grow anything that grows that I see on the street? Can I just grow that inside as well?
No, there is a difference. So if you think about the four things really that a plant needs, it needs light, moisture. I'm going to forget. Let me think. It needs light, moisture. Help me, Med.
Soil. It needs soil.
Soil. And there's one other thing. Oh, warmth.
Oh, warmth. Oh, yeah.
Okay. So light, moisture, soil, warmth. And those things vary between inside and outside. So actually, if you think about your home, unbeknownst to you, you are actually living officially in a desert, probably, because we keep our houses very warm, and actually because of central heating, they're quite dry. The air in a house is quite dry. But paradoxically, the light levels, because we've all got ceilings, the light levels are relatively low. Mm-hmm. So the poor old plants who have to try and survive in our house are living in a situation where they probably don't get enough water. The air is really dry. It's warmer than they might want. And the light levels are probably not enough. So that's why house plants are a sort of particular group of plants that can put up with these really quite bizarre conditions that we have in our houses. Whereas if you take, just a humble daisy from your garden and try and get it to grow inside, it would struggle. So on the whole, generally speaking, house plants are ones that prefer warmth, may or may not like it dry. If they don't like it dry, then they rely on you to water them regularly. And generally speaking, they'll tolerate lower light levels. And that's why if you're bringing a plant in from the garden, it's usually a good idea to have it on the windowsill. Try and find a windowsill that's sunny, but not too sunny, because the glass of your window might actually, create a sort of greenhouse effect and scorch the plant. So sort of not in direct sunlight, but on a light windowsill is a good place for growing. Say, for example, you wanted to grow some herbs, which would normally grow outside. Then a light windowsill is a good place.
What would a light windowsill be that doesn't have direct sunlight? Is that dependent on sort of north, east, southwest?
It sort of really depends on how much it's overlooked by other things like buildings and trees and things. But it would generally be a windowsill that might be facing sort of, well, I'm looking at my own windowsill now actually. It would generally be one that's facing west or east or north, but probably not south.
Okay.
But it does depend a bit on how much it's shaded by other things.
Mm-hmm. So if there's a tree outside of my home, and it's south facing, then that's perfectly fine, because it's still getting a lot of light, but it's not direct.
Exactly.
Okay. And what are some of the things that people need to know if they do want to grow plants indoors, but plants that aren't necessarily sort of your general, your general snake plant or something? Are there other types of plants? Because I think, often when I go to the, not now, but usually when I would go to the place where you buy plants, the nursery, the garden centre, the nursery, you find sort of the same old batch of house plants in one corner, and we've seen them over and over again. You've actually got a lovely ficus over there in the back.
Oh yeah.
But what can we do if we want to? Are there any other plants that we can grow inside? Are there perhaps vegetables or fruit plants that we can grow?
Yeah, well, the sort of classic fruit plant that you can grow is lemons, oranges, tangerines, citrus plants, because they, from the Mediterranean, they like the warmth and the light. they need a bit more space. They do need quite a lot of space. But also, I think things like tomato plants, you can grow those inside on on a sunny windowsill or in a sunnier spot in your house, because tomato plants actually only live a year anyway. So as winter comes and the light levels drop, they would have given you the tomatoes and be dying off anyway. So tomato plants are a great thing to grow. And the wonderful thing is that the nurserymen have bred so many different types of tomato plants. You can find ones that are dwarf and that produce those luscious cherry tomatoes. So if you haven't got space to have a sort of stonking great tomato that you find people growing on their allotments, you can grow a small one. And they're really, I mean, tomato plants are a great thing to start with, because you will instantly taste the difference. If you grow your own, you just get that lovely sort of warm yumminess of, you know, the flavour of a homegrown tomato is nothing like the sort of hard, relatively tasteless things that you get from the supermarket. So tomatoes are well worth trying. And then another thing that I love experimenting with is a thing called a cucumber melon, which is somehow a cross between a cucumber and a melon, and it's about the size. The fruit is about the size of an olive, and you just pop them in your mouth or have them with a salad, and they're sort of, as the name suggests, a sort of juicy, cucumbery, sweet flavour. And they grow a bit tall, so they grow probably about 1 metre tall. So they need a bit of support because they're sort of scrambly plants. But they are a plant that would not survive the winter outside. So you can grow them inside, and actually, if you keep them inside, they will survive inside through to the next year, and they just get better and better as the years go by.
Wow, that sounds absolutely delicious, and I think I'm gonna look them up straight after this and order me a now, you've been doing a lot of workshops, and I mean, I won't ask you more questions about how to grow them, because you're going to be showing us some ways of growing indoor plants in some of the demonstrations.
Yeah.
But you do a lot of workshops in which you do training, and you teach people how to grow stuff. Now, what does someone, you know, some of the people that will be watching this have absolutely no experience growing stuff, and often the reason for that is that they lack the confidence. You know, they'll tell you, oh, you know, I just don't have a green thumb, or they might say, you know, my plants keep dying. What would you suggest? What do you think can someone with no confidence, or what would you tell someone with absolutely no confidence in gardening? What would you tell them?
Well, I think the first thing to remember is that plants are, generally speaking, they're adapted to survive. And if you go outside, there will be plants growing in a crack in the pavement, or hanging off a wall, or by the tracks of a railway. So plants can grow without you, and they can also grow despite you. So it's generally quite difficult to kill plants, but I think if you do kill plants, it's not the end of the world. It's, you know, it's not like losing a person. I think the thing is just to relax with it and enjoy it. And I think one of the reasons why people are a bit scared, it's actually the fault of, I think, the experts like me and the television programs, because if you watch gardening programs, they tell you how to do it as if there's only one way of doing it. And if you don't do it like this, everything's going to curl up and die. But actually, what they're telling you is, first of all, they're telling you their personal opinion, what they've found from their experience, but they're also telling you one of several ways to do it. There's always more than one way to skin a cat. Yeah. So I wouldn't be too het up. I think pruning is a great example. You know, the experts will bang on about when's the right time to prune, but generally speaking, I prune often when I've got time. we're all living busy lives. So as I say, don't get too hung up about everything. And we, of course, you know, with the pandemic, everything's been slightly blown out of the water. But at our courses, we have what I call have a go gardening days, and very much encourage people to just get stuck in and have a go. And as long as you're not spending an absolute fortune on your plants, it's not the end of the world if they look a bit sickly and as I say, curl up and die. You can try again, try with something different, and that's the fun of it, really. You never quite know. I mean, one of the things about gardening is actually you have to get used to the idea of losing a bit of control. Because if you're a partner with nature, then you're a partner. You're not completely in control, and nature will have a bit of a say about what happens. You know, the books might say this plant's going to grow to 6 inches. Well, perhaps it only grows to 4.
That reminds me a bit of baking, because I'm more of a cooker than I'm a baker. And you know, with baking, I think one of the things is that, or the thing that intimidated me the most initially was that I just had absolutely no control. I had to put, you know, you put it in the oven and then that's it. It just keeps doing its thing and you can't meddle with it. And I suppose like it's the same as you say, you know, like it's the same thing with plants. You just gotta wait, and sometimes you gotta wait for a week for it to sprout and do its thing. And so all in all, there's absolutely, what you're saying is there's absolutely no reasons to be scared or intimidated by gardening. Just have a go at it, and there seem to be a lot of reasons for why gardening really is wonderful for your physical, but also your mental well-being.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, if people want to do a workshop with you, where would they do it? How would they find out about this?
Oh, well, I call my courses the Sussex Garden School. So we've got a website, Sussex Garden School, and we run courses at various garden venues in Sussex, because I think it's really nice for people to come along and enjoy looking at a beautiful garden, have a treatful day out, and learn some new things, get to know their gardens, or get to know some plants better, really. So it is very much about having some fun and enjoying the day out.
That sounds wonderful. Thank you so much for speaking to me, for telling our audiences about gardening and how and your work. It's been a pleasure talking to you, Juliet, and I hope to see you soon.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.